At first glance, no one gave it much thought. A 13-year-old boy, Everett Crane, was found trudging along the muddy banks of Coldwater Creek before dawn, wielding a borrowed spade to dig holes in the soft earth. By breakfast, his boots were already caked in mud, and by Tuesday his hands were raw with blisters. Soon enough, neighbors in Casey County, Kentucky, took notice. Everett never offered explanations. He simply kept working. He hauled in bundles of willow whips, long, supple shoots cut from mature trees, and pressed them into the soil along the creek's edge, spaced at regular intervals. From the old fence post near the pasture gate to the wide bend where the water slowed in summer, dozens of them were planted, all in late autumn with no leaves clinging to their branches and winter's bite already approaching. In a place accustomed to odd sights, a young boy planting bare saplings along a flood-prone creek in late season defied expectation. It became a quiet topic of conversation at the feed store. If stories like this, tales of quiet wisdom, patience, and genuine farming insight, resonate with you, hit subscribe and join our growing farming community, and share in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you. Everett was the second of 4 children on a tobacco and cattle farm that had been in his family since his great-grandfather first broke ground on it in 1908. His father, Dale, was a man of few words and steady hands, not given to empty gestures. His mother, Ruth Ann, managed the household, raised the children, and somehow still found time to cultivate the finest kitchen garden in the county. Everett wasn't the loudest Crane. His older brother Micah earned ribbons at the county fair, and his younger sister Lena brought home top grades. But he was the one who walked the fence line every Sunday morning. Not because he was asked to, but because he enjoyed noticing what had changed. One spring, he observed that the south field drained more slowly than it once had. He also discovered a dead calf and traced the cause to a loose wire 3 days before anyone else noticed. He never discussed these observations much. He simply watched and stored them away. The planting began the October after Everett turned 13. He asked his father for permission to work on the creek bank. Dale studied him for a long moment before saying, "As long as you're not neglecting your chores." That was all the blessing Everett needed. He ordered willow whips from a conservation nursery, paying for them himself with savings from helping bale hay for the Atchison farm down the road. When the bundle arrived, his neighbor Harlan Beecham leaned on the fence post and squinted at the sticks. "What in the world are those?" "Willows," Everett replied. "For shade, sort of." Harlan scratched his jaw and muttered something, but later told his wife the Crane boy was planting sticks in the mud. She laughed and said it sounded just right for him. Old Gus Whitfield drove by on his tractor, slowed down, and called over, "Boy, you know those creek banks flood every few years. Anything you plant there'll wash straight to Tennessee." Everett nodded politely and kept pressing whips into the ground. His own father watched from a distance, neither encouraging nor discouraging. Ruth Ann asked him at dinner what he hoped to grow. Everett said he'd explain when there was something to explain. No one pushed him. That was their way. What no one knew, not even Dale, was where Everett had gotten the idea. The previous summer, during the 2 weeks he spent with his maternal grandfather, Lester Bowen, in Bourbon County, something had shifted. Lester was a retired soil conservation technician who'd spent 30 years helping farmers prevent losing ground they couldn't afford to lose. At 74, his mind was still sharp as a drawknife. One evening, they walked to a neighbor's ruined creek bank, the kind of erosion that looks like someone had spooned away the earth. Lester stood quietly for a moment before asking, "You know what fixes this?" Everett shook his head. "Willows," Lester said. "Plant them close along the bank. Give them 2 or 3 years. Their roots dig deep, lacing themselves into the soil, anchoring the bank from below. Water can rise and push and pull, but those roots hold the structure together. They slow the water along the edge, catch the sediment, and keep the bank from caving in." He handed Everett a worn booklet from the County Extension Service, its pages soft from handling. Stream bank stabilization using native vegetation ***. Everett read it twice on the bus ride home. What Lester had described was real, rooted in conservation science. Willows, especially the black willow, native to much of the American South and Midwest, are among the most effective natural tools for protecting stream banks. Their root systems are aggressive and fibrous, colonizing moist soil rapidly. They flex under pressure rather than breaking. Planted along a creek bank, they act like a mesh beneath the surface, binding soil against the lateral force of moving water. Everett understood it the way only a boy who walks fence lines can, as something that would matter someday, not as theory. The first winter was harsh on the Willows. A hard freeze in January killed several whips entirely. A section of the herd found a gap in the temporary fencing Everett had built and trampled a dozen plantings before he discovered the damage. He repaired the fence and replaced the whips with cuttings he'd taken from the original stock, rooting them in buckets of creek water in the barn. In May, aphids hammered the new growth. Everett treated what he could, but some were lost anyway. Gus Whitfield passed by again in early summer, saw the struggling saplings and shook his head. "Might as well have planted broom handles," he said, not unkindly. There were days when Everett wondered if Gus was right. The surviving whips were pencil-thin and sluggish. A late summer drought left the creek low and the exposed bank cracked in the heat. 2 saplings near the curve simply gave up, turning brown. He pulled them and replanted with fresh cuttings, pressing them deeper and tamping the soil tight around each one with the heel of his boot. His brother Micah watched him one afternoon and said, "You know they're just trees, right? The creek, going to do what it wants." Everett didn't answer. He kept tamping. The second year brought improvement. The willows that survived the first winter put down serious roots. By midsummer, their thickening line of green was visible along Coldwater Creek, their long leaves trailing in the current when the water ran high. Most people in the county still gave them no second thought. The summer Everett turned 15 was one of the driest in memory. Then, in October, the sky made up for lost time, raining for 11 days straight. Not constantly, not a deluge, but steady. Soaking rain that left the ground unable to hold another drop. Old Rufus Dinkins, who farmed the bottom land 2 miles east, told Dale Crane at the co-op that the creek was running higher than he'd seen since 1993. Dale checked his own banks that evening. The water was deep, fast, and brown. Birds had been acting strange all week. The killdeer that nested near the creek had moved their feeding ground uphill 3 days earlier. Everett had noticed that. He hadn't said anything, but he'd walked the willow line twice the day before the worst hit, pressing his hand against the trunks, feeling the roots pull tight beneath the soil like cables under load. The county issued a flood advisory that afternoon. Dale nailed it to the barn door. That night, the family ate supper quietly, listening to rain on the tin roof. It came on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, Coldwater Creek had jumped its banks in 4 places between the Whitfield farm and the Atchison farm to the east. Gus Whitfield lost 60 feet of bank on his north pasture, gone, leaving a ragged new edge where his fence used to be. Topsoil was carried off in brown sheets. 3 of the Atchison fence lines were down, posts and wire tangled in debris 200 yards downstream. The low road between their farms was underwater until Saturday. Rufus Dinkins lost most of a hay meadow he'd been building up for 12 years. The soil there was dark and loose from years of careful tending, and the water took it fast. He stood at the edge of what remained on Friday afternoon, hands in his pockets, saying nothing for a long time. But on the Crane farm, Coldwater Creek stayed closer to its channel. Not perfectly. The water spread into the low edge of the south pasture, but the bank itself, the long stretch where Everett had planted 2 years earlier, held. Where neighboring banks showed raw, crumbling earth, the Crane bank displayed willow roots, exposed in places, bent and mud-caked, but still gripping the soil. The channel had not shifted. The topsoil behind it was largely intact. The reason was exactly what Lester Bowen had described on that summer evening in Bourbon County. The willow roots had laced through the bank's subsoil, creating a living net. When the water rose and pushed laterally against the bank, it met resistance not from hard structure but from a flexible, fibrous one that bent without breaking. Sediment that would have peeled away was held in place. The bank's structural integrity, reinforced by 2 years of root growth, absorbed what would otherwise have been catastrophic erosion. Nobody made a speech about it. Gus Whitfield came over on the following Monday to inspect the damage, or rather, the lack of it. He stood at the edge of the crane bank for a long time, boots still muddy from his own ruined pasture. He didn't say much. He asked Everett where he'd gotten the willows. Everett told him about the conservation nursery and wrote down the name on a scrap of paper. Gus folded it into his chest pocket. The following spring, Harlan Beecham planted a row of willows along his section of the creek. The year after that, so did the Atchisons. Nobody announced it. It simply spread the way useful things do in farming communities, quietly through observation and need. Everett Crane never told anyone he'd known it would work. He didn't need to, the creek bank said it for him. There's a line from Wendell Berry that lingers when you think about what happened on that farm. The soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Everett hadn't been trying to be wise. He'd been trying to protect something, a piece of ground his family had worked for generations, a creek bank that everyone else had simply accepted as temporary. He'd learned from someone older that the land will hold if you give it the right tools and enough time. The willows are still there. They're taller now, their roots going deeper every year. That's not a metaphor, it's just how willows work. And sometimes the most practical thing you can do looks foolish right up until the moment the water rises. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.